Well, here we are again, and in this open discussion we're going to have a discussion in regards to the formation of the Christian Churches of God. That's paper number 68, and the reason for this is because we're getting quite a lot of interest in the church, so we thought we'd explain the how and why of the formation, and so people can have a more informed approach to why they should come and study with us. We'll also be looking at the allocated names for the church, its common generic terms and its pluratic terms, and in the plural. And the question is often asked, Wade, as to the reasons for forming. And what would you tell the people about that?
Well, God had set aside the formation 2,500 years ago, more, 2,700 years ago, under the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 4, verses 15 to 27. And that was for the warning of the last days. What had happened with the Sardis system was that we'd had this false prophet take over the system. Now that didn't affect the baptisms and the structure of the church, and the Holy Spirit worked through the people of the church on a continual basis. But what ended up in the church was a conglomeration of false doctrines, and it wasn't just one. The worldwide system was full of people they didn't weed out for error. So it had the biblical Unitarian structure in the basis of the church, but it also had Trinitarian plants from the different structures trying to undermine it. It had ditheists from the false doctrines of Herbert Armstrong. Then it had binitarians who were trying to make sense of the ditheism of Herbert Armstrong within the framework of the Trinitarian structure with which they were getting all these false doctrines, such as in the forgeries in the King James Version, which were put there by Trinitarians in the 1400s from the Receptus.
Right.
And that became a source of major infection amongst the English-speaking peoples, and that affected the doctrines as well.
Right.
Then they had these Trinitarians and people coming in and still hanging on to their Trinitarianism. Then you had people who denied the pre-existence of Christ as radical Unitarians, and they came in from Freemasonry and other areas where they basically were adopting the doctrines given by the demons from the 28th to the 33rd degree, or up through to the 9th degrees of the York Rite. All these people were in the Church of God, and because they had false doctrines, they couldn't teach the truth.
Right.
So when the measuring of the temple occurred, it was taken over by these people who were basically quasi-Trinitarians, and they were trying to get acceptance from the Trinitarian system. And the Trinitarians were feeding them with false doctrine in order to destroy the Church of God, which they wanted to do, because basically the demons knew they had to get rid of the Church of God to stop us from forming. Under Jeremiah 4:15 to 27, they knew we had to form, and they knew under Revelation 3:7 to 13 we had to form.
Right.
So there's two witnesses in the Bible they knew, and they knew who we were and where we were going.
Right. Wow.
So when de Koch and his son and his other stepson decided they would join this Methodist system, a university in Southern California, Azusa College or whatever it was, they decided they were going to transform the church, and part of the their rationale for the measuring of the temple was those who didn't follow us into this, back into Trinitarianism, were really being measured and whatever. They didn't have a clue as to what they were actually saying. It was like Caiaphas, when he said a man has to die. In 30 CE, he announced that a man has to die for the salvation of mankind. He was talking about Christ.
That's right.
But Caiaphas didn't really understand the full significance of what he was saying, even though he was a high priest.
Right.
And he was announcing the death of the Messiah, he didn't fully understand.
Right.
That was the same with de Koch in 1987. I sat there and listened to him. And when he came to Australia to tell the Australians what was going on, and that's exactly where it was. That's what I understood to be the time frame.
Right.
We're about to deal with it. And I was sitting there with my wife and I said, that's where we're at. They're measuring the temple. This is the 40 years. And it was perfect. It was correct. Everything he said was theologically correct at that point for the measuring of the temple.
Right.
He just didn't know what he was talking about.
Misapplications.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, wait, just on further from that, what type of people started the church?
We were, as one minister said to me, said to others in the church, they're a mixture of sheep, wolves and lambs, which was exactly the description of the Sardis church at that time. And what happened was that I was telling them where they were going and what the logical outcome was, that they were going back into Trinitarianism. Now, of course, they knew that, and that was the plan.
Right.
But you see, I told them that to try and stop them from destroying the church, because we all knew what the end outcome would be, total destruction.
Right.
Because the brethren wouldn't buy it. Some of them did. And you heard them. I heard ministers trying to explain, and they were using Sabellianist theory on the candle, the candle, the flame and the heat on the candle to explain Trinitarianism, when it was used by Sabellius to explain Sabellianism, which was the opposite of the way they were going.
Right.
But they were using all the false doctrines in the King James
Right.
to try and, like the false doctrine in 1 Timothy 3:16, emulating God came down to the earth and spoke. It was just all the false translations written in the Receptus for the King James, and they were known forgeries. It was a forgery from the Codex Sinaiticus at Catherine's, and they used that and incorporated in the King James Version. Now, everyone who did any study on the New Testament knew that was a forgery. Like 1 John 5 verse 7, the three in heaven. Everyone knows that's an absolute forgery. It appears in no Greek text of the Bible anywhere. It only appears in the Receptus, and it comes into the King James Version.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a large paper on that as well, isn't there, the forgeries of the King James?
Yes, 164F.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems that the church has been growing quite substantially. A lot of people say, well, I've never heard of you, but that's because they've not been called or drawn yet, I would imagine. In large numbers in various countries. So can you explain maybe a little bit more of that?
Yes, well, what happened, of course, when we formed very quickly. Because I wrote to all the ministry and told them the errors in their theology, and I sent them the Electors Elohim. I wrote that for the conference at Headquarters Australia for all of the ministry, teaching them how to tell us how to become Trinitarians. That's what it was all about.
Right.
So I told them what the purpose of the plan of salvation was. I told them what our plan was to become Elohim, and that I told them what they were doing and what they'd done to the brethren, the elect. They'd rendered them to the Whos, and they'd made and they weren't going to do anything. The Bible, Ezekiel 34 said they weren't going to do anything.
Right.
And they didn't do anything, and they were worried about how to divide up the spoils, because they knew some would become Trinitarian and some would want to stay with their ditheism, binitarianism. But they ignored the biblical Unitarians who are in the church. And of course we got a lot of people who simply didn't want to be Trinitarians, and they came to us to form CCG, and we had a lot of people join us. And but then God started to sift them out, and we had people join us with the purpose of trying to destroy us.
Right.
We had plants of the Trinitarian churches come in and then try and seek. And the steps were always, as Russell says, it's always the same story. Get rid of Wade and get rid of the papers. That's always been the plan. And if they can do that, then they've achieved their aim and shut this down, because this is the important thing, the work. And it was done for the 30 years of the last days. And it went from 1994, when we formed CCG, on the 1st of Abib, the 1st of Nisan, 1994, we'd actually had our inaugural conference. We'd established the rules of the church and the Constitution. We'd already written that.
Yeah.
And then on the 1st of Abib and the new moon, we established the CCG and had its first
Right.
conference.
And under the Constitution, Wade, it'd be nice to explain that there is within that countermeasures to protect the church from these people that do come in that might aspire to try and take control or join the ministry. A lot of them come in because they think that they can become wealthy or get paid for their duties.
Well, under Ezekiel 34, the injunction was that the shepherds rendered the sheep to the hooves.
Right.
And they were judged for that. The next phase, which is in the Church of Brotherly Love of the Philadelphian system, was to establish a ministry that would look after the brethren and examine how the brethren would teach and treat each other.
Right.
So that phase was us. So we didn't have any paid. We can pay ministers, but they can't sit on the church, the boards of the church anywhere. If you're paid, you're not on the board of elders of the church. If I took $1 in payment, I can be reimbursed my fares, because that's fair if I can't afford to go all around the world all the time on a pension.
Right.
So we do have to be able to pay our fares, but that's not paid wages.
No.
In fact, out of our tithes, my wife and I pay our out of our wages, pensions, we pay tithes and we give offerings in the same way every other minister of the church does.
Right.
And the same way you guys do or work for nothing. And that's our aim, is to be to the people like Samuel, where we've taken nothing from them and we have given all of our intellectual property to the faith, and let God judge us
Right.
in that regard. Now, that's how we formed. We wrote it all in the Constitution. We had to make a couple of amendments to the Constitution because there were people coming in trying to destroy us. So we had to give time limits to the voting membership, and then we made it that voting membership was not guaranteed. You had to apply for it, and the elders had to agree to make you a voting member. And that was because of the major rebellions where we were stacked from the other churches, where they worked out we had a weakness, and that was if we got enough people in the church by the Sabbath year with voting membership at the Passover, on the appointment of ministers, they could outvote the voting members of the church. And that's what they tried to do. But they didn't do it properly, and they didn't keep the doctrines of the church properly. And we said, well, I'm sorry, you just lied about this for 3 years, now you're going to have to do it again.
Right.
So they didn't want to do it again because it didn't fit the plan.
Right. Thank you.
Now look, also Wade, I notice here that the church has always taught that there is the only one true God and that Jesus Christ is his son, and of course that's in John 17:3 and 1 John 5:20. If a person came to us and said, well look, I want to be part of the CCG but I'm not too sure about this one true God business, what would you say to them?
I'm sorry, we don't want you.
Yeah, it's obvious straight away, isn't it, that they would not be a true believer anyway.
Yes, we prohibit people for certain reasons. For instance, there was an entire Church of God Seventh Day in Europe that wanted to join us, but they taught that it was a sin to drink alcohol at the Passover. So you had to have grape juice at the Passover. They got this from the Adventists, these prohibitionists. And if you don't want to drink alcohol, it's only about 5 mils of red wine at the Passover. You don't want to do that. You're not in CCG. We won't tolerate you. We've fired ministers for teaching that you've got to drink grape juice, who got into the church and then started to teach that alcohol was a sin and that you really should have grape juice at the Passover. Right. And I got letters in from people saying, do you really teach this? No, we don't teach that. And I fired the minister who was teaching it.
Yeah.
That's the way it is. Right. And it is like the process of the brethren wanting to do things like vegetarianism and trying to teach vegetarianism. We won't tolerate vegetarianism and we won't tolerate prohibitionism in the church. If you want to have a grape juice at the Passover, go somewhere else.
No. Look, I noticed too on that one of the things that struck me was you get a lot of these churches that say, look, the Bible interprets itself, but, and they go on and give their personal interpretation, but I've seen very strongly that one of the things that the CCG holds to and says to everybody, you've got to hold to this, is that the Bible does interpret itself. The information can be presented in these study papers and then people go and check it out for themselves. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, the Bible is of no private interpretation. The apostles are quite clear on that. Yeah. And the Bible does have, in different areas, proper explanation for what it means in other areas. Right. And there are people who suggest that there are contradictions in the Bible. Everything that is apparently contradictory is there for a purpose. And that's covered in the paper Contradictions in the Bible. You'll find that if one text says it was on this year of the reign of this king, and another text says it was on this year, and there were one out, it's because the timing on the sequence is to make very clear which year it was involved. Not that there are two contradictories, because the rules of many kings were taken from, for instance, the conjoint reign. Nebuchadnezzar had his first year was a conjoint reign with his father in 605 from the Battle of Carchemish. Right. But his full reign began a year later. So there is a reason for things and statements of that like. And you have to know the Bible, what the time frames are, and you've got to know your history. Yes. So you know what the Bible's talking about. And we explained where these apparent contradictions are, and there's a paper on that.
Right. Now, is there any undertaking that a person must take if they want to become a member?
Yes, yes. Well, you've got to be baptised and have hands laid on you as a repentant adult for the Holy Spirit. That's the fundamental requirement of the church. But you also have to undertake to keep the laws of God and the calendar of God. And if you don't do those things, and the church publishes the calendar, we have produced the calendar right up through until the 2030s, 2032, and now we're about to publish it for the next 100 years. There's a team now working on the calendar that was from the new moons up and through until the 123rd Jubilee, the beginning of that. So there are specific requirements, and you've got to go away for the 3-year periods unless you've got pressing circumstances, which, like family, and your woman's got to stay home and look after her husband or whatever, or the family. That's different. But the males have got to go to the feast sites and present themselves 3 times a year.
Right.
You've got to do some form of tithing. You've got to keep the tithe process, which is the paper on that. And when you're pensioners, the widow's mite is whatever God you give to God and the church. It doesn't, God judges you on that. No, but we're not going to be checking on what you pay your tithes in anyway.
Right. And the tithing laws, the tithing paper was a great relief, because under the Worldwide Church of God system, it was very hard labour, and a few years there when I was with them, I nearly ran out of money because I was paying 1, 2 and every 3rd year I was paying a 3rd tithe, and then I'd do another 3 years of 1st and 2nd, and then I'd do another 3rd tithe. And then there's a thing called common, which they wanted off us, and being generous, or trying to be generous as you can at the high holidays, you give what you can to accordance of your financial situation at the time. And reading the tithing paper was a great big relief, and it just made more available income to go to the 3 pilgrimages and have the finances available for them. It does lessen the burden, even though it seems like it's more burdensome, because you have 2 extra feasts that you have to leave your gates to pilgrim to, that God has put his name.
Yeah. Well, an old friend of mine I've known since I was a young lad, teenager. He became a minister of the Worldwide system, and he said to me, Wade, he said, because he left Worldwide. He was one of Armstrong's staff officers at Pasadena. And he said, we used to have to take out loans to pay the 3rd tithe. Because it was a total misrepresentation of what the Bible taught.
Right.
And they had 7 collections a year. Now, it's absolutely forbidden by the Bible for anybody to give 1 cent more or less than the other at the Day of Atonement. It's not a collection, it's a temple tax, and that tax was paid for us by Christ.
Right.
They didn't get it. 3 times a year you go, and you not go empty-handed.
Yep.
So you're not to go empty-handed, and the men are required to attend at the feasts, and that's the law.
Deuteronomy 16:16 is clear.
Yeah, 5 to 8. Yep,
3 times a year.
3 times a year. And
Well, I was going to say, Wade, and again, there's a very interesting comment that's made in here that just says, we do not enter a church on baptism. We enter the kingdom of God and the elect become part of that church.
Yes.
So these people that are going to come in, and hopefully they will move in, are really the elect, aren't they? That's what this church is all about, isn't
Yes,
it?
yes. You can't say to somebody, oh, if you leave the church, you're going to the third resurrection, or we're going to get rid of you, or whatever they say. And these people do say it, and it's heresy. And the ministers, under James 3 verse 1, will be punished for that. Anyone who wants to be a teacher has to teach correctly, otherwise they're punished.
Right.
Now, what people don't realise is these things, there's a thing called Stockholm Syndrome, and it comes from brainwashing. And the churches of God have been systematically brainwashed for years. Since World War II, when Armstrong used advertising techniques and brainwashing techniques he developed, and the churches became so brainwashed they couldn't tell fact from fiction, and they became a very serious problem. And they had to be destroyed. The Sardis system had to be scattered to the four winds. It will not be allowed to be replaced. It has only one church to join, that is the Church of Brotherly Love, under Revelation 7 to 13, and it says in that text, you will no more go out, which means at one stage you did have to go out.
Right.
As it's taken from the Sardis system and the other churches of God, you then are brought into the Philadelphian system, which is the last system, and it didn't start in North America.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what name it's called, it carries the name of the Christ, and that's what Christ said, you have not forsaken my name. So it's not called the Philadelphian Church of God, it's called the Christian Church of God, churches of God, and it's plural, because they're all around the world.
Right.
Well, again, Wade, all I can say is thanks. And for you people out there, we trust that you'll enjoy any study and go set yourself out on a journey of discovery. Look at the truthful understandings, and by all means, avail yourself to the website of the Christian Churches of God.
Yeah.
Seek out the paper, seek out the information that you're looking for.
Yeah, prove us for the truth, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, and send us any questions.
Thank you.
All the best.